Hi, everybody. My name is Bridget Fisher, and welcome very much. Thank you for being with us today. I'm the Associate Director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis here at the New School, and we're happy to be sharing today our Older Workers Report, which we do quarterly each year. Our Retirement Equity Lab presented this data, and is going to share the report with you today. ReLab is a team of economists producing academic research to help solve the retirement crisis. We've monitored the status of older workers for over 8 years now. For the past year, these quarterly reports have focused on how the pandemic has affected older workers in the labor market. Today, we're looking at how the pandemic has changed retirement trends. Owen Davis, who's here with us today, is a ReLab research fellow and the primary author of today's report. He will present his work with Associate Research Director Siavesh Radpour. The presentation will take no longer than 10 minutes, and afterwards we'll welcome questions from the press and the rest of the audience, and hope you'll stick with us. We hope to keep this to 30 minutes, maybe 30, 40 minutes, so it won't take up too much of your time. So Owen, I will pass it on to you for your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Bridget. And thanks everyone for being here. Let me just share my screen and begin. And just let me know if you're not seeing anything, if there's any issues. So today I'm going to be discussing the pandemic retirement surge and how it has increased retirement inequality for older workers. So just for a top level view of what has happened since the pandemic began with retirement, we're just looking here at the change from the trend of what we would expect, the number of people who are retired 55 and older. So we're looking, so the 2015 to 2020 is our trend line. And then we see after early 2020, the number of people who are just in the overall retired population, 55 and older, really explodes above the trend by about 1.7 million people, we estimate. So beginning at the start of the pandemic and continuing on until the latest data that we have, which is as of April of this year, the total retired population has increased by about 1.7 million additional people beyond what we would expect that population to grow. Just for context, normally the population of, or at least lately, the population of retired adults in the US has grown by about 1 million a year, and they're around just under 50 million people who are currently retired. So an increase of 1.7 million in that population represents a significant increase in the number of retirements. And just before we get into really delving deeper into that data, I want to discuss why it matters that we're talking about this. And first is early involuntary retirement. We know from our research and that of others, around half of retirements are involuntary. So people lose their jobs and retire involuntarily or face health crises. And this is something that we're watching out for during the pandemic recession. And early and involuntary retirement leads to lower levels of retirement income and falling standards of living in retirement. And the second big focus that we have is on retirement inequality. And if we see, and as I'm going to get into, if we see those people who are better off retiring early, the less well-off people are retiring early with less retirement wealth and less retirement income, while better off workers have more options and can delay their retirements. That's going to lead to an increase in retirement wealth inequality. So where did these additional retirements come from? This 1.7 million estimated additional retirements that we've seen since the pandemic began. This chart just shows the change in the retirement rate for different age groups among workers 55 and older. Retirement rate just means the share of adults in that group who say they're retired. And this chart just shows the change from the 2019 average to the 2021 average in the retirement rate for different age groups. And if we just look at all workers grouped together, it appears that those 65 and older make up the bulk of additional retirements. 55, late 50s and early 60s, we don't see overall at the aggregate level, a large increase. But that change, the picture changes if we divide older adults by education. So now we're looking at same statistic, but the green line represents the change in retirement rates for non-college educated workers, and the orange line represents the change in retirement rates from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic for college educated workers. And we see, especially in that early retirement region of late 50s and early 60s, diverging trends for non-college and college educated workers. And with higher retirements for non-college workers and reduced retirement for college educated workers. So I'm going to go through and discuss, piece by piece, the different parts of this chart to bring out some of the story. So first off, just focusing on the entire non-college educated older population, we see increasing retirement across the age range that we're looking at. And this story is really one about job prospects and unemployment. This group of non-college educated workers had a peak unemployment rate in April 2020 when unemployment was at its highest, a peak unemployment rate 66% higher than college educated older workers. So these workers were more likely to lose their jobs. Non-college educated workers are overrepresented in service industries, in leisure and hospitality, in sectors that lost a lot of employment. And when these workers have worse job prospects than college educated workers, and that means their job security is lower. And it also means that when they lose their jobs, the kind of jobs they're looking at to get back into an employment may be inappropriate or difficult to attain for them. Pay is low. If it's restaurant employment or working in an Amazon warehouse, it might be unhealthy or dangerous for older workers. So we saw retirement increase across the age range for non-college educated workers, in large part about these job prospects and unemployment. And it's important to note that the median retirement savings for non-college adults 55 to 64 was only $9,000. That's the typical retirement savings for a household headed by a non-college educated worker. So these are workers who, if they are being forced into retirement at these ages, are not sitting on a large retirement savings, and they're going to face downward mobility and even potentially poverty or near poverty in retirement. The next group I want to look at is these college educated workers 55 to 64. And this is where the chart gets interesting. These workers seem to be delaying their retirement based, as opposed to a normal year. We see reduced retirement rates for college educated workers in their late 50s and early 60s. And again, this is a story that has to do with job prospects. These workers were less likely to lose their jobs than those without a college degree. And if they did lose their jobs, well, we know that older workers of all education levels have a hard time finding employment compared to younger workers when they do lose their jobs. But if you have a college education, at least the kinds of jobs you're looking for are going to be more appropriate, healthier, safer for an older worker. And this evidence of delayed retirement here is also consistent with polls that we've seen. The Pew did a recent poll that showed about a quarter of workers 55 and older say they delayed their retirement or they plan to do so. And this is the group where you might be seeing that. And then finally, looking at college workers 65 and older, we see pretty large percentage point increases in the retirement rate from pre to post-pandemic for college educated older workers 65 and older. And this is consistent with, there's been some media reporting on this, especially affluent and professional older workers moving up their retirement dates. They might have been planning to retire in the next few years, but the pandemic hits, and maybe for health reasons, maybe because they don't want to be on Zoom all day, or whatever other reason, people have moved up their retirement dates in some cases. But I want to caution that that's not the entire story. Not every college educated worker who's retiring early and unplanned because the pandemic is doing so just because they have tons of retirement savings and they just want to retire when they want to. We know that early in the pandemic, age was an unemployment risk. The older the college educated worker was, the more likely they were to be unemployed at the peak of unemployment. So that's going to mean that, you know, some of these retirements here are also people retiring involuntarily earlier than planned due to job loss. So it's important not to look at this group and just say they have higher retirement assets and this is all voluntary. So to wrap up these stories here, what drove the divergence between college-educated and non-college older workers in their retirement during the pandemic? The first major factor is employment prospects, especially for non-college educated workers. Lower job security and bad job options when they're unemployed means higher rates of retirement, even at those younger late 50s and early 60s ages for non-college educated workers. And then retirement readiness is also an important part of the story, where for those with more retirement wealth, so on average, college educated older workers have greater retirement wealth that allows them to retire sooner, or at least if they're forced into retirement sooner than they planned, they're able to cope with that better. An important factor I would note here that makes this recession different than the previous ones, that asset prices rebounded within about 6 months. And that compares to took the S&P 500 6 years to recover in the Great Recession. So older workers who have some retirement assets had the asset prices to do so. And then final piece of analysis here is then looking at the story by race. So this chart shows non-college educated workers on the left panel, and then college educated workers on the right. And then we're dividing it by race and age, where the orange bars are change in retirement rates for 55 to 64, and the green bars are 65 and up. And when we look at just the non-college group, we see similar to the analysis just before that for both white and Black, and to some extent Hispanic workers, non-college educated workers' retirement rates increased at every age group, with the exception of Hispanics. 55 to 64 was not a big change. And we see for the early retirement group, 55 to 64, Black non-college workers saw the highest increase in retirement rates from 2019 to 2021. When we look at college educated workers by race, a more nuanced story emerges. For white college educated workers, we actually kind of have the same pattern as we saw before for college workers, with delayed retirement at those younger ages and then increased retirement rates for the later ages. But for Black college educated workers, it's a different pattern, and it's indicative of delayed retirement, both at these younger late 50s, early 60s, and 65 and up. And this is consistent with the racial wealth gap, that Black older workers have median retirement savings of about $50,000 in 2019 coming into the pandemic, and that's less than a quarter of median retirement savings for white college educated households of $200,000. So Black college educated workers have less retirement wealth, and due to the interruption of the pandemic and the uncertainty surrounding it, they have to stay in the labor market longer if they can to build up the retirement assets to retire and maintain their standards of living in retirement. So this again just underscores the importance of employment prospects as well as wealth in the retirement patterns that we've seen through the pandemic. And we're going to continue watching retirement trends, especially as unemployment durations extend for older workers, and see where older workers go in the coming months and years. So thank you so much. Myself and my team are available to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you so much. I want to pass it now to Teresa Ghilarducci, who's a professor of economics and the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis here at the New School. So I'll pass it over to her to make some comments. And then in the meantime, I'd like to encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and then we'll get to them afterwards.
Thanks a lot, Owen. I wanted to reiterate what we all said. Here at the New School, we are monitoring the status of older workers because we're also monitoring the equity of the retirement dream for all Americans. because whether or not people are prepared for retirement and what that experience is depends upon their work life up until this point. So we're basically a life cycle shop here, and we really focus on the equity aspects of the wealth accumulation and the retirement experience. So I would like to open it up to our distinguished participants and attendees for a Q&A. And thank you for being here.
Well, so if people can put in their questions in the Q&A function, we'll go ahead and answer them. And I also want to introduce Sia, who is our research director here at ReLab, who's going to be proposing the questions to our team here. Sia, I'll turn it to you.
So the first question, hi everyone. The first question is, can you see the impact of employers calling workers back to the office for older workers? When do we see anything like that? I don't think so. Like there is this very small change about like moving from part-time to full-time, but we haven't seen any recent trends in coming back to work.
Yeah, I would just echo that. It's hard. I think, you know, that's a regional story and it's an industry story. And just for the current analysis, we don't have anything in particular on that.
The second one, which is also a very good question, is that are there any significant differences between men and women among older workers in retirement rates?
Yeah, and that's one where we see retirement rates actually decreased for women in the younger group, 55 to 64, and increased at the later ages. For women and men due to just different labor force participation rates to begin with. Those percentage point changes are going to be different because you know, you have fewer women workers to begin with, especially at that age group. So the percentage point changes are not directly comparable. But yeah, there are some different patterns, especially when you start looking by race and gender, education and gender. But overall, it's you know, if we're focusing on that early group of retirement, 55 to 64, it was men, non-college educated men, who saw the largest increase in retirement.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that these people, when we say like people are not retiring, it doesn't mean that they are working. So many women are out of labor force, have lost their jobs, but because they are taking care of like children or for other reasons are not looking for a job. They're not saying they're retired. It doesn't mean that they're working. It's the same for all the people that we show that are less likely to retire. It doesn't mean that they're more likely to work. No, it's just like they're expecting to go back to work earlier. And the other question. Great recession.
See, I think we had two more questions in the answered panel. Looks like
Okay,
Teresa has made some comments as well.
Yes. There is a question that Teresa has answered already, but I want to know what Owen thinks about it. How do you compare the trends during COVID pandemic to those during the Great Recession in accelerating the exit of older workers from the labor force?
Yeah, this one, I wanted to expand on this more, but I didn't want to make it go too long during the presentation. But a really important factor here that is not present now, that was present in the Great Recession, is asset prices, where, I mean, especially with middle-class households, so much of their wealth tied up in housing, and the housing crash occurring during the Great Recession, and then also stock market prices, taking 6 years to recover. That for those workers who had the ability to keep working, that was a disincentive to retire during that time. That factor hasn't really been present in the current recession because of how unusual it is, and the rebound of asset prices and housing prices are now even higher than before. So you don't have, I think during the Great Recession, you had the combination between the job loss and being pushed out of the labor market at one end, and really a lot of delaying due to asset prices on another end. And in the current recession, it's a lot more driven by employment prospects. So at the aggregate, sorry, it took a long time to actually answer this question. At the aggregate, the Great Recession, you really don't see this huge bounce in retirement overall for all workers in the same way you do see that for this recession.
New question, that if you could magically go back in time and implement one policy before the pandemic that would protect older workers and retirees financially during the pandemic, what policy would you choose? So Teresa, do you want to answer this instead of typing the answer?
We all might have our own. I think it would be if the Medicare age would have been lowered to 50, or I have a second one, if everyone had paid leave, that might have helped stop the infection. Anybody else on the team?
I think from the patterns that we are seeing, if we had to go way back. It's not just before the pandemic, but of course, if older workers who have more retirement savings, as we see, are first of all able to retire when they're at risk. So that's the big difference between those with retirement assets and those who don't. Because if you're at risk and you feel like you should retire, it's always hurtful to retire early, but there's a trade-off. So having more money gives you flexibility. So yeah, if we could go way back and give everyone retirement accounts and let them save for it, maybe that would be a good, that would give workers more options.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, a lot of this, the conclusions we're drawing from our current analysis is that employment prospects, ability to keep one's job or get a job once you're unemployed is a big driver here in the patterns that we're seeing. And in the US, the policy response to mass unemployment is unemployment insurance. And there's many debates going on about that, but basically you lose your job, you lose that relationship with your employer, but you receive financial assistance. And that's different than what you see in certain countries in Europe, Germany, for example, where the focus is actually to maintain that employment relationship and to subsidize incomes for workers who, and there was a little bit of this here, but it really didn't get off the ground in the same way. So where basically the government pays your salary while the company deals with the pandemic shock, and those employment relationships are maintained. And that's especially important for older workers because older workers have a harder time once they're unemployed on the labor market trying to find a new job. They face age discrimination. They face difficulties, as I mentioned during the presentation, in finding jobs that are just appropriate for them given their needs as older workers. And so the system that we have where it's you're out of work, but we're going to financially assist you doesn't maintain those employment relationships, and therefore it disadvantages older workers where employment relationships, especially building up seniority, is very important. Yeah, and like throughout the pandemic, from the very beginning in April until now, you can see the effects of age discrimination. The older the worker is, the more chance that they get laid off. And it's still true, and we still have high rates of unemployment for older workers in each category. Even when you compare like 55 to 64 to those who are older, you see the higher unemployment rate for them. And the fact that they experience higher unemployment rate and higher risk of job loss, it means that we do need stronger like anti-age discrimination legislation and enforcement. The last question I think is, oh no, we have two more. One is that, do you expect this retirement surge to continue and for how long? I don't think we can answer the question about how long, but we can say if we expect this to continue, if the current situation continues. Because like, as we see, the trend is upward. Like if you look at the first chart that Owen presented, like more and more people are retiring the longer the pandemic goes on and the longer people experience long-term unemployment. Do you want to add anything to that one?
Yeah, sorry. Oh, and I think what you were saying is that if asset levels and the people who have 401ks still feel that they can retire, then it may actually. But lower income people who don't have the wealth may actually not retire if they're really brought back to the labor force. That it's segmentation. I think that's the rule here, that it's not equal across all income groups.
Yeah, and I think if our concern is those the groups that don't have sufficient retirement assets and have less labor market power, we have, for those who are still unemployed, the unemployment rate has come down, but there are still, I think, out of the labor force plus unemployed for older workers is around 2.5 million due to the pandemic. And as unemployment durations or out of the labor force durations increase from, a few months to a few years, I think it stands to reason that you'll see increased retirements. Now, whether that continues at the same trend of the first chart I showed, we don't know. But especially if the employment recovery continues to stall for older workers, which it has, I could see that the number increasing.
Okay, and the real last question is that, do you think older workers were directly impacted by COVID might have factored into the higher retirement rates? Teresa, do you want to answer that? Because I see that you have typed some.
Yeah, that was our first remark when this first started and people were going back to work, whether or not older workers were more afraid than younger workers. And we have not seen any evidence. People who have old people at home are afraid. People who have compromised people at home are afraid, but older workers don't seem to be any more afraid. We don't think this is a supply effect. It's workers not going back to work. We think it's age discrimination, and the way older workers have been treated in the past have just been exacerbated by this recession.
Yes, and this is not, we don't have sufficient evidence for that, but our very simple analysis showed that the rate of retirement hasn't changed from unemployment or from employment. It's not like workers are more likely to retire from unemployment or more likely to retire from employment. The main difference during the pandemic, the main thing that has changed the retirement pattern is the higher unemployment rate. So it's not really a supply side effect. It's just people giving up and moving from unemployment mostly to retirement. Okay, I think we don't have any other questions.
Yes, I think we're wrapping up. It's 1 o'clock too, and wanted to stick to our promise to be quick. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to Owen, Teresa, and Sia for sharing the information, and to Michelle and Teague for running the webinar behind the scenes today. I want to let everyone know we will be sharing the video and the slides with everyone via email afterwards, and our next report will be out in April. And in the email, you'll have my email address if you have any questions you need to contact us or our staff. Thank you again for joining us. Bye-bye.